Hi, folks. Hey, I don't know if everyone can hear me yet. I don't know if there's anybody out there to watch this yet, but I'm sure things will start up in just a moment, so please be patient. I will be adjusting things so my banner is no longer up. So, how's that? Is anybody out there yet? Oh, there's Rich and Stephanie. Hi, folks. And Scott Dunn. Okay, thanks, everybody. Can you do a few shares for me, please? Can you do a few shares for me, please? That would certainly help a lot. Okay, we'll give people a few more minutes to connect up. Okay, let's begin now, folks. Can everybody hear me okay, first of all? Great, great. People can hear me. That's wonderful. I'm really happy with that. So let me continue on now then. Okay. My title for this evening is The Coming Phony Fiscal Crisis. First, we have to note that fiscal crises in nations like the United States that are monetarily sovereign are, in a profound sense, phony because they're not really fiscal at all. Not really fiscal at all. Why so? Well, because they're political crises caused by policy disagreements related to the exercise of political power and the broad acceptance out of either belief-based or cynical commitments to false ideas and political memes. We'll get into what those memes are in just a moment. But in the United States, before the end of this fiscal year, we're likely to experience one of these crises. One that's so serious that it has great potential for causing big damage to the economy with great suffering for many Americans, as well as political fallout, promising more suffering in the future. But first, since I said earlier, I limited this to nations that are monetarily sovereign, and I said that fiscal crises like the one we're going to have are phony in monetarily sovereign nations. So what is monetary sovereignty? Well, it means three things. Three conditions have to be satisfied at once. The government issues non-convertible fiat currencies. That means when you have a fiat currency, that means you can't go to a government gold window to exchange your currency for gold, or to a government window to exchange your currency for any other commodity you may want to use as money. That's not allowed. If you go to a government window to exchange your money for something, what the government's going to give you is the same kind of money again. It's going to give you U.S. money. If you give them a $10 bill, they might decide to give you $10 in return, or they might decide to give you a new $10 bill, or they might decide to give you 2 fives. Okay, but whatever they decide to give you, it's going to be U.S. money. There isn't any other alternative. They only exchange money for U.S. money when it's a monetary exchange, okay, that's going on. Of course, the government takes U.S. money in return for its publications, for example. If you go to the government printing office and you want a copy of a report, then you give them U.S. money and they will give you a copy of the report. Okay, or you can order the report by mail in return for what eventually is U.S. money given to them. In other words, it may start out as a check from you or a wire transfer from you or something else, okay, but eventually the transaction gets settled in U.S. money that goes to the government printing office. So, second, monetarily sovereign governments, like the United States, allow the price of their currencies to float in international markets against the other currencies of the world. They don't attempt to fix the price of their currency relative to other currencies. They let their currencies float. So we let our currency float. And the British let the pound sterling float. And the Australians let the Australian dollar float. And the Japanese let the Japanese yen float. Though sometimes not quite. Sometimes they play around a little. But generally speaking, they allow their currency to float. And the third condition for monetary sovereignty is that the government does not contract for and therefore owes no debts in foreign currencies. Okay? It doesn't borrow foreign currencies from other monetary sovereigns. And it doesn't incur any debts in those currencies. The only debts it incurs are in U.S. dollars, which are the dollars that it has the freedom to issue. So, these conditions mean that there are no financial constraints on money creation for fiat sovereigns. That either the legislature of those nations cannot directly overcome if it wishes to, or that the executive, using measures previously passed by the legislature, cannot overcome to fulfill legislative spending mandates. Now, those last two qualifications are necessary because it's customary in many fiat sovereign countries, including the United States, to have constraints on the executive branch, or for Congress to accept constraints on itself, not just accept them, to legislate constraints on itself. of course, it can always repeal the legislation. So those constraints are not constraints that the government is chained to or tied to. They are the same kinds of constraints as you have when you put on your shoes and you tie your shoelaces together in order to constrain your walking for some reason. Or they're the kinds of constraints that you put on when you want to run a sack race against somebody else. But they're always constraints that you can take off when you want to take them off. Okay, I have a question, which is a very important question. Teresa Sanders asks, Joe, would you say we are a fascist country now? It seems like it to me. And some friend says, dude, straighten out your freaking bookshelf. Well, for Teresa Sanders, I'll say, well, okay, I don't think we've reached fascism yet, but I do think we've reached a state called inverted totalitarianism. And give Trump his 8 years, and we may yet get to fascism. But I don't think we're there yet. I think we're still in the transition from inverted totalitarianism to fascism. Now, what is inverted totalitarianism? I'll leave that discussion for another time, because that's not the topic of our talk here tonight. But you can certainly Google it, and you can look up Chris Hedges and Sheldon Wolin, Wolin, and you can find out exactly what inverted totalitarianism is. So there you go, Teresa. Okay. So to go on, the constraints I spoke about are important in most of the fiat sovereigns, because for some reason they're afraid to take off all the constraints. I think that's a hangover from the gold standard. So there are 3 triggers of the coming phony fiscal crisis. The first is that in order to avoid a government shutdown, Congress needs to pass a bill which appropriates fiscal 2018 spending before the beginning of fiscal 2018. Because if it doesn't do that, then the government won't be able to spend any money in fiscal 2018, which starts on October 1st. Now, they can pass a continuing resolution or something like that to allow spending to go on at the same rate and of the same kind as in 2017. And they can pass that for a temporary period until they finally do pass a budget resolution, or they may not pass a continuing resolution. They may shut down the government in early October over that. The second trigger of the coming fiscal crisis is that if no health care bill is completed soon, Congress will be facing a hard September 30th deadline for passing a 2017 budget reconciliation bill. I should explain that for just a minute. When the Republicans scheduled their health care bill to be passed under the rules for reconciliation in the House, that committed the Senate to pass the health care bill under the same rules. And those rules mean, okay, some of what those rules say is that the reconciliation bill only applies until the end of the fiscal year. So if the end of the fiscal year comes and goes, then the Republicans will have to take up the matter again in the new session of the Congress in early 2018. And if they still want to go that way, they would have to pass another budget reconciliation bill, okay, at that time, and start all over. But that would be inconvenient because 2018 is an election year. And I'm not sure that the Republican Congress wants to be caught in 2018 trying to pass an unpopular bill through the reconciliation process. I may be mistaken about that. Okay. But that's what I think would go on. Teresa Sanders contributes the comment that Warren Buffett was on PBS TV saying it would be economically better to have single-payer health care. Well, I'm not sure what I'm not sure what our friend Warren Buffett has in mind by economically better, but I would say the same thing. It would be economically far better, because if we did it through, if we were to pass such a bill, I've gone on record as saying that it would create 2.5 million net new jobs. So yeah, that would be far better, and it would save families a great deal of money out of pocket. And so I think passing a single-payer health care bill would be wonderful. But it might not be wonderful for the Republican donors. It might not be wonderful for the Democratic donors, okay, a lot of the Democratic donors. So there are a lot of people who, unfortunately, will remain against single payer, I'm afraid, and that we probably won't easily get around that. Okay, so the third event triggering the phony fiscal crisis. In September, Congress is going to face another debt ceiling crisis because the executive branch, which might have exceeded the debt ceiling at the end of March, has, through extraordinary measures, quote unquote, it does these extraordinary measures every few years now, it has postponed, the day of reckoning when it passes the debt ceiling, probably through the end of this fiscal year. It's now expected that the executive branch won't be able to avoid hitting the debt ceiling much beyond the end of the fiscal year on September 30th. So Congress will be facing another debt ceiling crisis. That is, it will have to make a decision whether to raise the debt ceiling or not. And while for many people this is thought to be a no-brainer, this is not necessarily a no-brainer for our current Congress. Congress people don't like to go on record as raising the debt ceiling. They also don't like to go on record as being the ones who got rid of the debt ceiling entirely. But maybe they ought to bite the bullet and do it once and for all, because then they wouldn't have to face the question, coming back like a bad penny every couple of years, to bedevil them. But I guess they haven't figured that out yet. So, anyway, in recent years, the Republican austerians, that is, the Republicans who believe in austerity and blood-sucking the American public, are going to take the opportunity, along with their Democratic austerian allies, to call for further cuts in federal spending, and then members of both parties will try to maneuver the other party into being blamed for the unpopular legislation that may come out of this phony crisis. When the phony crisis hits, most probably in September now, though part of it could hit before then, but assuming we postpone the day of reckoning on the healthcare bill until September, it probably will hit in September for sure. Then, at that time, we will hear all the false ideas and memes, so people can claim there is a real funding crisis. Well, the dangers of this phony crisis are very severe. First, failure to pass new debt ceiling or budget legislation can cause a government shutdown and perhaps a squeeze on debt repayments and entitlement spending. No Social Security checks, no Medicare payments, and the possibility of a default on government debt instruments, which would be a catastrophic situation for the United States, and also an event which would violate the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which commits the federal government never to default on its debts. Also, failure to make entitlement payments would trigger lawsuits, as people entitled to the entitlement payments would be represented by groups that would file suits to claim that since that entitlement spending was previously appropriated by Congress, that entitlement spending does constitute a legitimate debt of the government, also protected under the 14th Amendment. There are varying opinions as to whether this case can be made successfully or not, but probably people are going to line up in the courts to try and make that case, and to get the courts to make a quick decision on it. Then we could also have interruptions in federal wage and salary payments to employees and contract payments to vendors. This would cause interruption in goods and services from the government. Even a few weeks would have a severe impact on the economy, as well as an impact, on politics. The last time the Republicans tried this in Congress, which I believe was, I forget if it was in 2013 or 2014 now, billions of dollars were lost as a result of a shutdown, not even a complete shutdown, but a partial shutdown, which occurred for a period of 3 weeks or so. It took years to make up this impact, if it ever in fact has been done. Now, Donald Trump can short-circuit such debt ceiling difficulties by causing platinum coins to be minted and deposited over at the Fed, and then having the Secretary of the Treasury sweep the seigniorage into the Treasury spending account. Now, this would be a good thing if he does this, and he's much more likely than a conventional politician to do it, okay, in my view. But at the same time, he'll be getting an awful lot of static from the Republicans in his cabinet and also the Republicans in Congress against doing any such thing. In particular, his Health and Human Secretary, Tom Price, is going to strongly advise against minting any platinum coins to get around this debt ceiling. But Donald Trump is a man of no great patience, I think. And he may decide that he doesn't want Congress monkeying with him and his executive branch. And he doesn't want any military spending, okay, or military appropriations to be somehow shackled or postponed, or military contractors to be stiffed, or to have international debts defaulted on. And so he may just say, well, to hell with all you guys. I'm going to mint $1 trillion coin and give you more time to raise the debt ceiling. How do you like those apples? He could do that easily. Even if he does that, though, other difficulties would remain, including the extreme danger of some austerity compromise passed by the neoliberal forces in Congress to resolve this phony fiscal crisis. Well, let's review what this fiscal crisis is based on, the kinds of beliefs that support the idea that this is a fiscal crisis. One, of course, is that old favorite, the government is running out of money. And the second is the government can only raise money to spend by taxing and borrowing. And a third is that Social Security and Medicare are running out of money and can't get enough funds to pay full benefits without taxing or borrowing. And a fourth is we need to cover government spending and make do with no more money because we don't have any money. And the fifth is our government spends more than it takes in, and that is not sustainable. And so we shouldn't be spending any more than we take in anymore. And the next is the federal government has deficit and debt reduction problem, which must be addressed through reducing the deficit. And yet another is if government borrows more money, then bond markets will increase government interest rates, thus driving up interest costs on government debt. Yet another, government debt, public debt is growing faster than the economy, and again, is therefore unsustainable. I'm sure you've heard the one is, we can't keep adding debt to the national credit card. During this phony crisis, you're likely to hear all those and some others, that high debt levels equal fewer jobs and lower wages. So we've got to lower the debt levels in order to make more jobs and have better wages. Ho, ho, ho. Like they believe that, right? So they'll also say delaying action on the national debt means it will be much more difficult to protect Social Security and Medicare from abrupt, severe, and widespread cuts in the future on all beneficiaries if we don't legislate a compromise to the fiscal crisis that cuts those things right now, rather than waiting for the future. Make a lot of sense to you? Not to me. If we do not address the debt now, federal investments in education, infrastructure, and research will decline. And yet another false idea is taking steps to address our deficit now would mean a more robust economy and significant job growth over the next 10 years. Well, maybe so, because if we address our deficit now by balancing the budget, let's say, we might get another decade of depression now, which we will eventually get out of in 10 years, and therefore have a more robust economy then. In other words, that may be a case of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, yet another favorite homily that you'll probably hear is that our grandchildren must have the heavy burden of paying off the national debt. That is, the public debt subject to the limit, in technical terms. Okay. And Paul Ryan says, frequently, we face a crushing burden of debt. The debt will soon eclipse our entire economy and grow to catastrophic levels in the year ahead. Well, I think the debt has eclipsed our entire economy, if by that you mean the GDP in a single year. So what? But anyway, going on, some more false ideas. The next generation will inherit a stagnant economy and a diminished country because of this burden of debt. And another beauty from Ryan, we believe the days of business as usual must come to an end. We hold to a couple of simple convictions. Endless borrowing is not a strategy. Spending cuts have to come first. Those convictions are certainly a bit simple, though a more apt description for them might be simple-minded. In any case, also delaying action on the national debt means it will be much more difficult to protect Medicare and Social Security from, I must have repeated that, from abrupt, severe, and widespread cuts in the future on all beneficiaries. Well, I suppose a really good one is worth repeating. So, the Austerians also say foreign-held government debt presents special solvency problems. Yes, it does. Fortunately, we don't have foreign-held debt in their currencies. We have foreign-held debt in our currency, and that doesn't present any special solvency problems. Oops. I'm sorry, I jumped the gun on answers to these myths. And the final myth I'll present here, which is about 1/3 of all the myths you're going to hear during this period, is that the government is like a household when it comes to finances. And since households can run out of money, the government can also run out of money. Here's the basic reason why all of these myths are untrue. They're all based on the idea that there is a government budget constraint, or a GBC. But there is no government budget constraint. Why? First, because the U.S. Constitution allows the creation of money without limit, and the U.S. also remains a monetary sovereign. We have not yet given away our monetary sovereignty, and therefore still are living under the original Constitution. However, a government budget constraint seems to exist when people observe the government because Congress locates the power to create money out of thin air, primarily in the Federal Reserve System, by requiring that the Fed not extend credit to the Treasury, by either allowing it to run a negative balance in its accounts or by monetizing the debt by the Fed directly buying the issued the Treasury debt from the Treasury. And also, the Congress has placed a constraint by imposing a limit on the amount of outstanding debt subject to the limit which is allowed. That's the constraint that's currently causing the debt ceiling part of the phony fiscal crisis. Well, I started out by saying that this GBC seems to exist or appears to exist for those reasons. But the idea that these do constitute a GBC is deceptive. First, because Congress can always remove constraints since they are political and not economic. In other words, the government can always untie its own shoelaces. That's no problem. Second, because the analysis that says that these rules constitute a constraint ignores the 1996 legislation allowing the Secretary to mint platinum coins of arbitrarily high value in order to repay debt and to spend the appropriations of Congress. For example, I frequently use the example of the $100 trillion coin. And third, because the account that says that there is a government budget constraint ignores other types of public debt that don't fall within the legal category of debt subject to the limit under the law. In other words, there are lots of other debts that the government can constrain that don't come under the category of debt subject to the limit. So the $20 trillion debt ceiling, or the $20 trillion some odd debt ceiling, which we have right now, doesn't cover all the debts which the government is authorized to incur by the Congress. And that analysis ignores the these other types of public debts. So, assuming we don't have a government budget constraint, here are some ideas and memes that are true. Our favorite one here at Real Progressive is taxes do not fund spending. And by the way, as we've seen in previous shows, that is strictly true. Before the Fed credits the Treasury spending account with credits, with new credits that commonsensically are associated with taxing and spending, the Fed destroys the money raised, and through taxes. That is when it marks down the Treasury tax and loan accounts in the private sector. That marking down destroys that money. Then when the Fed turns around and marks up the Treasury spending account with a corresponding account, the Fed is creating a different kind of money. In the first case, what's in the Treasury tax and loan accounts is not high-powered money. It's money that had been basically created by the banks because those Treasury tax and loan accounts are in the private sector. There's still money in the private sector. But when the Fed marks down those accounts, it's destroying that money. And the money it's giving to the Treasury in the spending account is entirely new high-powered money. It has to be that way because high-powered money is the only money the Fed is authorized to create, and high-powered money is the only money which the federal government is authorized to spend. So taxes literally do not fund spending because they cannot fund spending because spending is funded first by congressional appropriations and then by the Federal Reserve marking up the Treasury accounts. So, okay, the next meme that's true. Congress funds spending, and the Treasury is legally obligated to use the tools Congress has given it to force the Federal Reserve to fill its spending account as required in order to spend what Congress has funded. What Congress has funded is a directive to the executive to implement, to spend, to implement through spending. Okay. Next, a fiat sovereign government cannot be forced to run out of money. It can only decide to run out when the legislature decides we're not going to pay our debts. Like, for example, the legislature in Japan decided at the end of World War II that it wasn't going to pay its foreign debts. It defaulted on those foreign debts. Now, it was a monetarily sovereign government at the time, so perhaps it didn't have to default, but maybe it did, because maybe the victors were requiring payment in their currencies and not in Japanese yen. So, there you are. But the point is, a fiat sovereign has to voluntarily decide to run out of money. Otherwise, it can always print its own money. In fact, a fiat sovereign government can create whatever amount of money it needs or wants to buy any goods and services available for sale in its own country, or pay any debts that are due and payable in its own national currency. And another truth is that government can and does create money all the time when it spends. We've already seen how the Federal Reserve creates money to fill the Treasury spending account. And then the Treasury spends that money into the private sector. It creates money in the private sector by spending it into the private sector, as it is mandated to do by the Congress. We may need to cut government spending or raise taxes to maintain or create price stability, but only if we have full employment and inflation. Otherwise, we need to get to full employment, and we need to achieve other goals consistent with the public purpose. Here's another idea and meme that is true. Fiscal sustainability, which you'll probably hear a lot about in the coming weeks, is never an issue for a monetary sovereign like the United States. Where they say there's a fiscal sustainability problem, and you say, you're full of it. The government of the United States can always create the money it needs to spend as long as it remains a monetary sovereign. So there's no fiscal sustainability issue for a monetary sovereign. Fiscal responsibility is another matter, however. It's always an issue because fiscal responsibility is spending on public purpose. And most modern governments that we see around the world, and that are monetarily sovereign, do not most of the time spend on public purpose. But they use criteria like the level of the debt to GDP ratio when they budget. And they spend on what interest groups and donors to the political parties want them to spend on. Now, things may not be as bad in some other nations as they are in the United States with respect to that, but still, much government spending in nation after nation is not fiscally responsible because it is not intended to achieve the public purpose, but private purposes of various kinds. The federal government further cannot have a debt financial problem because it is a fiat sovereign. But it can have a deficit problem if it develops a demand pull inflation problem. Then, if it continues deficit spending, it will have to take active measures to control price inflation. Now we get into the bond markets. If a country is a fiat sovereign, the bond markets can't increase government interest rates. Interest rate policy and interest rate targets are determined and met by the Federal Reserve, by the central bank, in coordination with Treasury spending and Treasury issuance of certificate of deposit like savings certificates, otherwise known in this country as debt instruments, as part of debt subject to the limit. Those are really like CDs sold to the private sector. Of course, there's always the old one. We can't keep adding interest-bearing debt to the credit card, but in fact, we can keep adding interest-bearing debt to the credit card if we want to, because we can always use the money-creating power to repay our debts whenever they fall due. Now, we may not want to keep adding debt to the credit card, because for policy purposes, we may not want to give the rich and the corporations a risk-free investment vehicle anymore. But that's a policy matter. We can do it if we want to do it. Going further, the United States has no need to issue debt in order to deficit spend, since it can just create the money it needs without selling debt. On the other hand, our creditors do need Treasury debt to acquire an interest-earning zero-risk return on the reserve dollars they are holding. They don't just like to hold reserve dollars at the rates the Federal Reserve is now paying. They'd like a little higher interest rate, which they get from the debt instruments, where if they need cash anyway, they can always negotiate those debt instruments and get others to buy them and get more liquid cash if they need to in a very short time. Also, when holders of reserves buy federal debt, it is just like transferring dollars from one's checking account to one's savings account holding term deposits. That's a favorite, of Warren Mosler's. And next, there's no historical evidence that high public debt levels even cause fewer jobs, much less equal fewer jobs. But there is plenty of evidence that fewer jobs precede high debt levels that are caused by automatic stabilizers. Automatic stabilizers are the spending the government does to provide a safety net for the economy once it's collapsed. So if you go through country after country, at the time of the crash of the economies in 2008, you'll often find that there were low debt to GDP ratios in countries that now have much higher debt to GDP ratios. Those higher debt to GDP ratios were caused in part by the automatic stabilizers kicking in response to the crash. So it wasn't that the high public debt levels were causing the crashes. It was that they were the result of the crashes. Further, it's true that loans create deposits in private banks. So, there is no loanable funds market and no crowding out of private sector borrowers. Those are not facts of life, because the Federal Reserve allows private banks, when they make loans, to create dollar deposits in the borrowers' accounts at the banks. The Federal Reserve supports the banks doing that and issuing those credits. That's part of stabilizing the banking system. So note also the following: neither the level of the debt nor the level of the debt to GDP ratio need affect federal investment, because the federal government can afford to buy as much of anything as it thinks is needed. For a fiat sovereign, the only way that paying off the debt subject to the limit can be a burden for our grandchildren is if they try to pay off the debt by running budget surpluses in order, quote, to acquire the funds to pay it off. They cannot even do that because, as we've seen, taxes don't fund spending. So taxes are not what pays off the debt. A surplus is not what pays off the debt. What pays off the debt is newly created money in the Treasury spending account by the Federal Reserve. That's what pays off the debt. But nevertheless, there's old Paul Ryan and all the other Austerians and Peter G. Peterson and most of official Washington telling us that we need to lift the burden of debt from our grandchildren by paying off the federal debt by running these budget surpluses, which will require us to have bigger taxes than we have now, which will, of course, make us poorer now and make our grandchildren poorer now. So, they want our grandchildren to shoulder that heavy debt right now, or at least shoulder the burden, experience the burden of that heavy debt right now. And they think this is better than doing things in a way that won't require any burden for our grandchildren at all. I wonder why they think that way. Okay, today I was listening to somebody talk, and they pointed out that the wealthy really resent it when poor people can take vacations the way they can, when they can go to restaurants the way they can, when they can enjoy some more of the rewards of life in the same way the wealthy people do. And it struck me that, of course, the reason why some rich people may feel this way is because they probably wonder what the incentive is to get wealthy if poor people had a few of these things too. So what they're about is making sure that poor people won't even have a taste of the good life. But it's for their own good. It's to preserve their own incentives to engage in the struggle in the jungle to get wealthy the same way that they did. So, how do we oppose the phony policy choices of a phony fiscal crisis, which they're going to be giving us very soon? I think the best way to oppose the crisis is to hit the lies and the memes that the Austerians will be spreading. Hit them with the truths that I've given you here, that I've listed here. Protest using the same ideas and memes. That is the true ideas and memes. Try to make people understand that the U.S. has no financing, fiscal sustainability, solvency, or running out of money problems, but only fiscal responsibility problems in getting our politicians to spend government money for public purpose rather than private purposes. The only real problem we have is an unwillingness in both parties to spend for the public purpose rather than spend for their donors. So now, by way of concluding my statement tonight, what I want to do is issue another call to action. Look, I know it's tiring. I sort of notice I've been starting to issue a call to action every single week. But look, we never promised real progressive members a rose garden, did we? And we don't have a rose garden. We have the Austerians and the corporatists and the inverted totalitarians and the plutocrats coming at us every single day, every week, every month, trying to make the government work in such a way as to profit them and to screw us. So we have to fight. We can never relax. We have to occupy those Facebook and Twitter pages. We have to call whenever we can. We have to protest in front of congressional office. We have to do videos. We have to visit our representatives to make our points more strongly. We have to call every day. What we have to do more generally is we have to create a climate of opinion, that bombards them with, no, we know you're giving us BS. We know what this is really about. We know that there are no financial problems. We know that the only problem is that you won't spend for public purpose. And we want you to know that if you won't spend for public purpose, you're going to be out of there. As soon as we can get you out of there, there will be nothing you can say to us. There will be nothing you can do about it. There will be nothing you can do to prevent it. We are sooner or later going to end your careers because you're not fulfilling your responsibility to legislate for public purpose, for the 99%, and not for your main campaign donors. If you won't stop, we're going to get other people who will stop and who will legislate for everybody's good and not for the good of the rich and the few. It's creating that climate that is so important. It's bombarding them with messages like that, which is so important. Because, you know what? They're getting bombarded every day by the lobbyists, raising money for them, holding parties, telling them about this idea or that idea or the other idea they want passed or they want put into a bill by way of amendment. They're being bombarded every day that way. Their staffs are every day too. And as difficult as it is, we have to generate a cloud of frustration and anger and resentment and opposition and calling them to account and telling them we are not fooled anymore. And we are increasingly against you for good if you don't quickly turn around and do something about this. We will not lose our democracy for good. We are not happy with this inverted totalitarianism. We will not allow the transition to fascism. We will not allow you to do what you want with the economy and the political system. We will find people who will win office against you. We will find people who will pass the laws that need to be passed for our good. What I want you to do is coordinate with Real Progressives activism group and any other groups fighting our battles with us. In the phony fiscal crisis, we'll be fighting for Medicare for all. And we'll be fighting to make it clear to as many people as it can possibly be made clear to that this whole fiscal crisis thing is bullshit. There is no fiscal crisis. There's just an unwillingness for these politicians who are supposed to be serving us to fulfill their obligations to serve us. That's the crisis. It's the political crisis. It's the crisis of bad faith. It's the crisis of corruption. It's the crisis of dishonesty. It's the crisis of immorality. It's the crisis of Cory Booker. It's the crisis of Hillary Clinton. It's the crisis of Paul Ryan. It's the crisis of Tom Price. It's the crisis that all those people have visited upon us. And it is not a financial crisis. It's a political crisis. That's what we're fighting. A political crisis. It's a continuing political crisis. But it's one that will reach a crescendo towards the end of the summer, then subside for a little while, and then come back and back and back. Because this is a war. It's not a battle. And it's going to be a long, drawn-out war against them. It has been so far. The ground is hard won, and even when it's won, like the defeat of the TPP, they're right back the next year trying to take that back in a different way. Or like net neutrality. We won a battle on that front last year, but here they are this year, and they're back due to Trump's appointment, trying to kill net neutrality again. We have to do everything we can to stop them. Net neutrality is vital. It's vital because the kind of resistance that real progressives and popular resistance and many other allies of ours are dependent on is net neutrality. If Comcast can cut us off or kill our effectiveness because they're able to slow down all our broadcasts, to stop effective communication through those broadcasts, this will reduce our chances to be successful. So net neutrality is vital to us for the medium and longer term, and for the short term too. And Medicare for All is vital for all those people who will die if it does not pass. And avoiding unnecessary fiscal cuts by Austerians screaming poverty and screaming fiscal unsustainability. All these things must be stopped to the best of our ability. And if they're not stopped, then we have to overturn them in the new fiscal year. Best to stop them now. Well, I see a bunch of interruptions going on my image. I don't know why that is. But I certainly missed a lot of questions, okay, and missed a lot of comments. Okay, and missed a lot of comments. So if you have some questions you want to put up now, I see Kathy Butari says, how about an online petition with a letter to Congress letting them know we know the truth and that they ought to shape up and ship out? I certainly think that's one thing we can do, Kathy. Do we have some other ideas? Net neutrality is everything? No, it's not everything, but it's a prerequisite for an awful lot of things. It's something we must have. How are the Dems on net neutrality? They're on net neutrality the same way they are, okay, on everything else. They're a hair better than the Republicans. More Dems are in favor of it and will probably fight for it to some degree. But there are many other Dems who will sing songs in praises of it, but who will sell out at the last minute using the Cory Booker model. We're in favor of drug importation from Canada, but not until we have guarantees of quality of the drugs coming in from Canada. When the drugs coming in from Canada, of course, are most probably higher quality than the drugs we're producing here in the United States. We've got to become the masters of rebranding, Stephanie says. We have to become the masters of rebranding. Gigi Schaumburg says, it is a class war. Well, technically, I'm not sure it's a class war because I'm not sure the 1% actually constitutes a class in the Marxian sense of class. Okay, it's certainly a war between the haves and the have-nots. Certainly a war between the ruling elites and the rest of us. But whether it's a war, but whether it's a class war, I'm not sure. Somebody wants to plagiarize this segment verbatim. I must have had a real good segment. Okay, Carmen Munez says, friends, do you think Randy Bryce, who's challenging Paul Ryan, might be receptive to MMT? I hear he's raised the mad money already. I'm not familiar with Randy Bryce, except to the extent that he's challenging Paul Ryan. I don't really know what he thinks. Okay, folks, are there any new comments or questions that I can entertain right now? Okay, I'll give you a little while to put them up. And then, if there are no further questions, I'm going to sign off for the night. I'm making a deliberate effort to make these broadcasts shorter. Okay, Patricia Ann, are you asking me when my epiphany about MMT was? Well, my epiphany occurred somewhere in the beginning of 2010. And it occurred because I read The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds by Warren Mosler. As so many of us have, we started off with that particular book. And of course, while I was reading the book, I read some other blogs also. I found Bill Mitchell's blog, and I found also some other blogs that were writing MMT. And pretty soon there was the New Economic Perspectives blog. For a while I was a reader and a commenter there, and later on I became a poster there. I had a pretty easy epiphany. And the reason why was because I read some books which appeared during the 1990s, which were not a part of the MMT movement per se. One was a book by someone by the name of Rick uh, 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 Boettger. And Boettger, Boettger, was a management science person who wrote a book called The Deficit Lie, and who got supported in that book by Robert Eisner, who kind of endorsed the book and was very friendly to the views expressed there. I read also Robert Eisner's The Misunderstood Economy, which was written during the Clinton period. And Eisner was a former professor, of Bill Clinton's, who tried to influence him in the early part, of Clinton's term, his first term. And I think Clinton entertained some of Eisner's views and Robert Reich's views also. But then he turned to Bob Rubin as his main mentor, in economics. And that meant he was totally captured by the neoliberals. And the third book I read was by Francis X. Kavanaugh, who was, I forget, either a Federal Reserve official or a Treasury official, at that time. And he had views about the reality of how money was created and spent. Those three books gave me a perspective which was very friendly to MMT at the start. So when I read Warren's book in 2010 or late in 2009, I forget exactly when I read it, I was ready. In the first 3 months of 2010, I read everything I can get my hands on, on MMT. And I had already started writing things. First things I began to write on was actually a review of the Seven Deadly Innocent frauds in 3 blog installments. And then, at the beginning, of April, I heard about the fiscal summit that Pete Peterson was running for the first time at the end of April in 2010, which was scheduled to coincide with the kicking off of the President's National Commission on Reform and Fiscal Responsibility. That was the commission that became known as the Cat Food Commission. And I became incensed at this fiscal summit, which was going to occur. So I set about with some collaborators and friends of mine to organize a fiscal sustainability teach-in counter conference scheduled to occur on the 28th of April. And somehow, with the help of the MMT people who came to present there, we were able to pull that effort together in 3 weeks and held our conference in one of the auditoriums at George Washington University. The attendance was not great. We probably had a limit of 50 people there, but we had some press coverage. And we also had Bill Mitchell from Australia, and Warren Mosler, and Stephanie Kelton, and Randy Ray, also Pavlina Chernyeva, and Marshall Auerbach, last but not least. And they were brilliant, and they answered all questions. They just, the Q&A, the presentations were great, but the Q&A questions were just as great. And even though we had very little resources to use, we managed eventually through the efforts of one of our number, Celise by name, that's our handle anyway, we were able to get the media online at her site, the Netroots Mass site. And there were videos there, and there were PowerPoint slides there, and there are transcriptions there. And a lot of the videos are posted up on YouTube also. And they're still there to this day. And I'm telling you, that was a wonderful conference for learning MMT. There were a number of MMT writers and students and commenters who actually got their starts there. Okay, and there were a number of people who later were developing similar bodies of thought to MMT, who were there also. Similar but opposed in certain key ways. But still, quite a lot of what they did got started there. Okay. So from my point of view, it was a wonderfully successful conference, and the resources are available on the web till this day. I will give you the link, Teresa. I'll comment on this broadcast after it's over. Okay, and I will give you the link to the Netroots Mass site there. So you will have it. Okay. Oh, and by the way, someone asked in connection with my broadcast of last week whether I had a cheat sheet for that. And yes, I did have a cheat sheet. And since then, I posted it up in the Real Progressive files in the form of PowerPoint slides. So if you go to Real Progressive, you can find them there. Okay, and as I say, I will supply the site very soon to everybody. That is the Netroots Mass site. Okay, just a little later tonight. So if there are no further questions, I'm going to end the broadcast now. And I'll see you next Saturday. And maybe before then. Hopefully before then, I intend to start more live streams during the week. Those will be more impromptu and more venting about our current political situation. So thanks everybody for coming. And until we meet again, good night.